Today's episode is brought to you by a little bit of a hard truth. And here's the hard truth of the day. No matter how good you are at what you do, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you want to help others, none of it will make an impact if you don't know how to reach your audience. You're hearing me right. Your work will not make the difference it could if you do not know how to communicate your message in a way that resonates with the people who need you and the work you provide most. None of it will matter if you don't take the leap and give yourself permission to find your voice and build your own platform. And yes, that means you're going to face some of the inherent self-doubt and criticism from peers that comes with the process of self-improvement and learning. But here's the case, guys. The cost of doing nothing is far greater than the cost of making a mistake or hearing somebody grumble under their voice. We all have skills. We all have value that we can provide. And though I know it doesn't feel that way to those of you that are perfectionists, there are people out there who need what you do. And that's exactly why we created our online course, Blind Spot. It is made to help you build your brand and business the right way by turning what you know into what you do. It's going to help you identify your core strengths, how you can provide the most value to others, and then systematize that in a way that helps you get it to your audience so you can stand out without selling out. So if you're somebody that's felt like, I love learning and I'm always looking for ways to improve myself so I can help others, but I feel like I lack some of the confidence, experience, and knowledge of what to do next, go to artofcoaching.com/blind spot. If you are somebody that says, yeah, I know I have knowledge to share and I definitely have a desire to help others, but I often feel like an imposter who's going to care what I have to say, artofcoaching.com/blind spot. Finally, if you're somebody that knows you need to take the next step in your career for a while now, but you have people that rely on you and you can't afford to take a silly risk only for it to fail and you're not sure if you can pull off what you want to do, go to artofcoaching.com/blind spot. It is going to reopen soon. You can get sample information and details about this resource. You have lifetime access. So it doesn't matter if you're in 30 courses right now, or you're traveling to Timbuktu, or you got your Aunt Mary's Sisters Brothers reunion down the road. You can literally do this whenever you want. It's easy to follow along. artofcoaching.com/blind spot. Welcome to the Art of Coaching podcast, a show aimed at getting to the core of what it takes to change attitudes, behaviors, and outcomes in the weight room, boardroom, classroom, and everywhere in between. I'm your host, Brett Bartholomew. I'm a performance coach, keynote speaker, and the author of the book, Conscious Coaching. But most importantly, I'm a lifelong student interested in all aspects of human behavior and communication. I want to thank you for joining me, and now let's dive into today's episode. Very excited for you guys to hear this interview. My guest today, Mark Fisher, is a social savant. And aside from being an international speaker, consultant, and entrepreneur, he is somebody that just understands the nuances of human dynamics and psychology better than just about anybody I know. And through his keynotes and courses and coaching, Mark helps training gym owners achieve financial success and personal freedom. Some of his most popular topics that he speaks on includes building cult-like cultures, and yes, you heard me correctly on that, time management, and sales and marketing for good human beings. He's also excellent, and he put this one in here, but rightfully so, at playing with puppies, though to date, he admits that he has not been paid for that skill set. Mark and his non-sexual life partner, Michael Keeler, founded Business for Unicorns in 2016 and have since worked with many of the leading fitness studios across the US, the UK, and Australia. Now, that's not the only field that he's been in. Past non-fitness clients include Sony Music, Sylvan Learning, Novus Surgical, and Security Scorecard. He's also a proud alumni speaker of TEDxBroadway. In addition to consulting, Mark is the co-founder of Mark Fisher Fitness, one of the most unusual gyms in the fitness industry. So if you're somebody that really feels like you're struggling to find your niche, this is an individual that you should absolutely take inspiration from. Mark Fisher Fitness operates a physical location in Midtown Manhattan and a fast-growing online virtual location. They were recognized as number 312 on the 2015 Inc. 500 fastest growing companies in America, as well as one of Men's Health's top 20 gyms in America. Guys, I don't know what more you could want. This is a fast-paced conversation. I am going to urge you to make sure, like always, get notes ready to go, or make sure that you at least screenshot something if you're driving in the car and you want to come back to it. That way you don't miss it, because the amount of tactical takeaways that he throws right away are immense. And I'll also say this, give people like Mark some credit. We don't do the usual podcast thing where we start with their whole life story and what have you. I throw them right into the deep end, sometimes with questions that catch them off guard. But Mark took it all in stride. He crushed it. Make sure to turn the volume up and let's get started. Mark Fisher, thanks for sitting down with me, man.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Hey, the reason that I think this conversation is going to be so valuable, especially for not just me and hopefully you, but our listeners, is you have an affinity for running away from leadership bullshit, right? We talked about this a little bit off air. You have such a unique background that we talked about before in the bio, but talk to me because you use very particular language and our audience likes jumping right into conversations where you said, yeah, I think a lot of this perfectionistic base, look at me, everything's great, and I turned my mess into my message-based idealized leadership can be toxic. Elaborate.
Yeah, it can be toxic. It really, and I'll share specifically just a little bit about my own experience as a leader and an entrepreneur and someone trying to find my way in the world. So I am a avid reader and consumer of professional education. I read tons of business books. I go to lots of conferences. I'm always looking to learn. And when I was a younger fellow, what happened was, when I now look back in retrospect, because so much of the business books out there and so much of like the speaking circuit and the keynote circuit, which I want to qualify, there's a lot of great stuff. And so I'm not knocking, I'm not saying much of it's not worthwhile. But in retrospect, I got into a really bad place of just feeling like I was an idiot and I was the only person that was so bad at my business, because many of the books are either written by a consultant who is speaking about their clients are amazing, or like the customer service at Ritz-Carlton, and then the flight attendant ran them to the thing, and that's what service is like. And oftentimes, of course, and I don't judge this is a consultant looking to sell their service. Oftentimes, there's a whole series of business books that are literally written by a consultant that is just to kiss the butt of one particular business and tell their stories of how amazing this business is. Or if you do have someone tell a messing story, to your point, it's always through the lens of, oh, things used to be really messed up, but now it's really great and amazing. Buy my thing. And I think the challenge for me with that was, I felt for a long time, and this is a very human thing to feel, oh, everybody really seems to know what they're doing around here, and all these other businesses, Zappos, they've got it all figured out all the time, and everybody at Starbucks is emotionally and spiritually fulfilled every minute, all day long. And meanwhile, Mark Fisher Fitness is having a lot of success. People keep telling me how amazing my business is, and every time I want to die inside because I'm like, well, I don't deserve any of this praise. Sometimes my team gets frustrated with each other. Sometimes people get in arguments, or they even gossip about each other behind their back. This place is super messed up. Now, thank goodness, I'm a little bit older. I'm like, oh, actually, in the grand scheme of things, we do actually pretty good. But I think that type of approach is toxic, because I think it can help create this endemic imposter syndrome that is probably going to be there no matter what you do. But I know for me, when my life really started to open up, when I started to find the mentors, I think the sliver of people that are 100% candid, not only about the challenges they've had, but that they're still figuring out as they go along. And that gave me a lot of permission to feel like I'm okay just the way I am. And at the very least, to enjoy my work a little bit more, and to understand that business, this is a quote I know you use as well, like all good crafts, it is a craft in which we are all forever apprentices, right? None of us will ever be masters.
Yeah. And first I want to applaud you for jumping right in with a question like that. That is usually not how we lead off a podcast, but with you, I did it in particular because of this. You mentioned imposter phenomenon. You mentioned a lot of things there. And now I'm going to invite the audience to get some context of how we know each other. If you recall, I met you through our friend Chad Landers, right? And
Right.
This is out in California during one of the most chaotic moments of my life. I just accepted a new role, jumping more into the business side of things, and now splitting between being a coach and a business owner. And here you come, meeting us at this eclectic cafe. And I'm listening to you talk like you're fucking Tony Stark. You're talking like, and you're very humble. So that's the antithesis of Tony Stark in that, right? But what I mean is, it's immediate from the moment I met you that you're just wired differently. I'm hearing about the books that you've read and your business, and Chad's explaining your business model a little bit surreptitiously. I'm looking you up online when I went to the bathroom. I'm like, this dude's got all this laid out. And what was great about it is, I came up with these very kind of hardwired, and I've talked about it on the show a lot, these mantras of what a good coach is and they're humble and they don't self-promote. And I saw what you did with your business, where it clearly wasn't about you, but you weren't scared to put your face in front of it. And then you could talk about complex topics. And then I saw you again in Seattle. And this is at the time that we were building Art of Coaching and taking a lot of lessons from performance into different cultures, right? Corporate cultures, Wells Fargo, what have you. And I read your bio. I'm like, good Lord, this guy's spoken for Sony. He's worked with businesses in the UK and what have you. And at one point, I even called you and I asked you the most basic business question around pricing imaginable. And it gave me this sense of wow, is there a lot to learn? Wow, do I have a long way to grow? Wow. And so what became fascinating about this is the more I got to know you, the more that I valued and respected you, because you admitted, yeah, man, listen, we have a good thing going at MFF, but we don't have all of our shit figured out. And here's some of my mess too. Yeah. Right. And here's where things are going cataclysmically wrong. And I remember hanging up the phone probably a year and a half later when we talked again. I told my wife, I'm like, that's a real one. That's somebody that wasn't scared, even though that they've done all these things, to not in a fake or faux humility type way, be like, hey man, there's plenty of times my world crumbles. Why do you think that's so hard for people in professions, whether it is fitness or strength and conditioning or things where we're supposed to be strong and upfront and outright? Obviously vulnerability plays a role, but what else goes into this idea that keeps people from just admitting that shit's crazy sometimes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's interesting because I, for better or for worse, am so just wired the other way to be so transparent that if anything, I've had to learn to modulate myself because I don't want to make people feel wildly uncomfortable, because I'm personally so comfortable with yeah, here's a disclosure of a challenging thing I'm going through. I think, the base level, certainly, I imagine some of it is frankly just protection of ego and not wanting to admit to other people or even to ourselves that we're not in a good place. I think certainly that is part of it. I think it's interesting. I was having a conversation before this with my business partner, Michael, and we were talking about this when it comes to leaders, where I think it gets a little more challenging even there, because I think oftentimes when someone is any kind of leader, whether you are looked to as a thought leader and a role model, or you're in an organization where you are looked to by your team and hopefully trusted to make decisions that are going to be good ones that will do good things for everyone's career and desire to serve the mission of the organization, I understand there is a balance to be struck between having confidence and strength and casting a vision. And I personally don't think that's mutually exclusive with also being transparent and a real person and totally honest about where you're not sure about a thing or where you think you maybe could have done something better. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people misinterpret that, and they do think they're mutually exclusive. And they think that to concede that they've either made a mistake or that they don't have this one thing figured out, or unwilling to say, I'm not good at this, I need your help, I don't think I do this as good as you, can you help me? For some, I think a lot of people think that means they're losing the strength of leadership and that the leader needs to be strong and tough and got that, riding, my hand is on the till and I have this sociopathic will to win. And I think that's not correct. And frankly, everybody, particularly in an organization, kind of knows what's going on anyway, right? Human emotion is so porous that I think it's better just to acknowledge that and And the reality, like, I do think there is a place for strength. There is a place for vision casting. There is a place for will. All that stuff can still be useful. But frankly, I think it lands a lot better and is a lot more human and accessible if we marry that with like candor and vulnerability and frankly, naming the reality that is apparent to everybody anyway.
Well, and that's a great point. I'm glad you finished with that of naming the reality, because within this, and you mentioned your staff and setting expectations and also balancing that with vision and this healthy blend of optimism and, hey, here's the reality. There was no script, no playbook, no anything any of us could have ever read that would have helped us deal better with COVID, right? It threw everybody off. That said, like, you have to have some difficult conversations with your staff around that. I mean, you guys, and I'll allow you to elaborate on it. You have a brick and mortar business. You had to transition, but before all that, like, how did you even address the, I don't know the exact answer of how to do this factor with your staff when these things were at its worst? Because also for anybody listening, like, you're in New York City, right? You guys were massively impacted. Could you talk about how you had those discussions, or even what the process of thinking, how do I frame this so that we don't create panic, but there's intense pragmatism and transparency here?
Yeah, I think, it's hard maybe to come up with a precise framework that works in all scenarios, because I think the context will probably lend itself to different frameworks. But
sorry if I didn't say that clearly.
Yeah,
I mean, in your case.
Yeah, I think that, because even in a place like MFF, like, depending on, because ideally your dream as a leader is sometimes this can be seasoned differently depending on the individual and the way they receive and hear things. But I think broadly, there is still value in getting clear on what reality is, what we know. I think there's value on probably identifying, here's the thing that we don't know yet. And then, yes, there's always place as the leader to go first, to cast the vision and get clear on, here's where I think we need to go. Here's why we need to go there. Here's what's in it for you. Here's what's in it for the mission. Here's what's in it for all of us. And I think that framework has probably served us pretty well. And I think, frankly, at MFF internally, this is an interesting thing I don't think we've talked about, and maybe we should talk about more. We've, I think, clearly benefited from 10 years of social capital with our community of clients. And that has really been helpful because they've really showed up for us. They've been willing to try out new services with us. They've stuck with us during a very, very strange time. I think we've also taken advantage of 10 years of social capital with our team, which is not to say it's Disneyland. It is not a utopia. That's not to say that people's feelings don't get bruised. There's not like major personal tension or disagreement from time to time. But the reality is, because we've invested so much time in each other's relationships, and people do, I think, know each other first and foremost as humans, I think that has been a lubricant over the past year. And for what it's worth, and maybe this is me telling myself a useful story, I also think we've got pretty reasonable people that just get it. This was, in some ways, I'm not saying I don't want to sound like COVID was easy, but it was such an extreme situation that for the most part, I don't know about you, I have been finding people have been pretty flexible here in the apocalypse, right? People on the team, clients in the apocalypse, people are pretty flexible. So that I think is both because people don't just understand this is a weird and challenging time and everybody's doing the best they can. But I do think, like, those years of really developing the relationships, I do think, again, not that I'm a perfect leader or not that there's many things I've done over the years that people have disagreed with or even disliked, but I will say this, I'm very confident that people on our team trust me and Michael as humans, that we're generally doing the very best we can. We generally have their best interest at heart. And I think that allowed this past year to be as easy as it could, knowing it was still, not fun in certain moments.
Yeah. And with that, and I want to give you a little encouragement on this, and because I know we live in an interesting time, and every podcast approach is different, but you never have to worry about our audience interpreting you as saying you got it figured it out or you're the perfect leader.
Yeah.
So, and if anybody is a new listener, that's not what we do here, and that's not on. So Mark never needs to say that again.
Great. Thank you.
One thing to build off that, and there's a question wrapped in here somewhere, but this is also a real discussion, is, you're right about people giving a little bit more grace. And I liken it to, and this is a situation where I'd usually need to qualify this statement, but I think you get it because you think in a very wonderful, abstract, interconnected way. My wife and I had a baby during COVID, and it's very much the kind of grace that you get when you have a child, of people understand life becomes chaos, right?
Yeah.
And we found there were certain situations where I really, just happened recently, we had to cancel on a friend, long-standing commitment and plan. Our child had gotten sick and slept all day. I'm like, dude, we're 3 hours. Yeah, we're not going to do it at that point. And we saw similar things with COVID, even with our staff. And it's interesting because I think and I maybe want to push here in a different space, even if the easy answer is going here. I think it's easy to say, all right, well, let's look at this with staff that is understanding and gives you grace. Well, it all just comes down to how we hire and the culture. And yeah, for sure, there's that. I mean, if somebody looks you up and we see Mark Fisher half naked with unicorns, which I want you to explain. But it's more than that, right? It is the way that we wield words. It is helping people understand a shareable context. And by the way, hiring or maintaining tranquility just based on culture and all these things, it's not really that easy, right? This is a semi-ambiguous term. Yeah. Some of it just comes down to saying, hey, we live in the most fast-paced, chaotic time in human history. We need adapters. I can give you strategy as simple rules. We can have our 10 principles on the wall. But at the end of the day, are you just an adapter? And are you somebody that's going to listen? And people will show you who they are over time, especially like this. It kind of weeds out the bad apples and the people that weren't loyal.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Anything you want to extrapolate on there? It's not necessarily a question as much as, one, does that make sense in conjunction with what you're saying? This whole idea of grace, giving the nature of the situation, or do you think you can? No, Brett, I think you can hire people. You can kind of scan for personality traits or what have you that should shit hit the fan, they're 100% going to be able to be relied upon. And that culture is everything. I mean, it's a tricky word. How do you even feel about that term as it applies to dealing with chaos and managing a business?
Yeah, it's so ineffable, right? It is, because culture is something, as you know, I talk a lot about, and it's this ineffable soup that you're swimming in that also, I think, like any bottle you're inside of, it's hard to read nutrition facts of. So of course, I'm not probably the most reliable narrator about MFF, but I do think it's certainly, we have made good hires along the way. And I think this is an interesting point. I don't know this for sure, but I posit that part of what has led to the level of communication, level of trust we have at MFF is we have lots of difficult conversations with each other. Like not 100% of the time, but have you by chance, I'm sure I've referenced this book before with you, Crucial Conversations?
Yep.
Okay, so that is a Bible for me. That is a book that we all read, and then we all read Crucial Accountability. And I don't mean to pretend that those conversations happen every single time, but this is like funny, not funny. At MFF, let's just say, you're going to have a serious conversation when someone sits you down and they pull out a paper. Yeah. You're going to read something on paper because I'm so mad at you. I wrote this down because I want to make sure I say all the things and I go through the framework, and I'll start with, here's the mutual purpose. Here's the inarguables. Here's the behaviors I've seen. Here's the story I'm telling about them, what I'm making them mean. Here's how I feel about that. Here's what I don't know. What is true for you? And that, I think, is counterintuitively the willingness, I think, to have those difficult conversations and more often not less let things fester has been a big piece to the health of the culture, right? Because what we don't want, what we almost probably never want, is a placid culture where everything's going great all the time. How are things, boss? Things are great. Everything's great. And admittedly, we've had periods at MFF where, listen, things were good. There just wasn't a lot going on. There wasn't a lot of challenges, but over the course of 10 years of having a business, if there are not challenges, that would be unusual. And you want conflict, you want healthy conflict, you want people to, first of all, in meetings, air disagreements and really fight for what they think about, so you get the best thinking, right? As the saying goes, if two executives agree on everything, one of them is unnecessary. But even beyond that, the reality is, and listen, I'm not saying this is everyone's approach to business, but this is my jam, right? If I'm working close with people on a thing that matters to me, we're going to get stressed. We're going to get passionate. And if we have some diversity of personality styles, we're going to upset each other sometimes. We're going to inadvertently at times really rub up against each other in negative ways. And I am committed, particularly at this point in my life and career, to only working with people that are able and willing to say the thing to my face so we can have that conversation. And I will say, I will give a little bit of leeway because I understand the power dynamics of the leader is invariably, I'm never getting things 100% straight all the time from everybody. So I understand that. I give some allowance for that. But the older I've gotten, the less, frankly, tolerant I've gotten of my ability to work with anybody that can't tell me what's going on, because I know that I believe is the key to having real meaningful relationships. It doesn't even mean you need to be friends with everybody you work with, but just that we have the ability to be honest and to be human with each other and not fall into the political backfighting that can happen, even in small organizations where people split into their little fiefdoms. I just have no patience for that stuff. And what I love about having a business is, to some extent, I always say it's like I get to make the city I want to live in. I am testing a hypothesis, a philosophy of life in this business. I'm testing a hypothesis. This is what I think, how people should show up and behave with each other. And for me, one of those things is, I can say this very clearly. There is not a situation, if you're on the Mark Fisher Fitness team, if I hire you, dear listener, if I have some feelings about you, you will know. You never have to worry about me having feelings about you. You certainly don't have to worry about me talking to your colleagues about it. I will let you know how I feel, and I will do my best to do it in a way that is kind, that doesn't rob you of your dignity, that aware I don't know all the things, but is candid and is very direct about what's going on so we can have a conversation. Because also on the other side of that, I know that we get closer. And I think that is a thing that is often, I wish more people understood, because I understand some people have barriers with conflict. And again, strangely, for whatever reason, I wouldn't say like I love conflict. I don't get up and be like, today is a day to get in a conflict, but I don't mind. I have trained myself that if I have a beef with somebody, it's always better. I want to have that conversation. If anything, I have to slow myself down, because otherwise I'll sometimes happen too quickly when I'm heated, because I know on the other side of that is relief. I know on the other side of that, we'll know each other better, we'll be closer. And all the things we can't say in life hold our power, right? Which is so cliche, but it happens to be factually true. And I just know my ability to function at work and as a human in the world is directly correlated to, are there things and conversations I haven't had yet, or I'm afraid to say, that are bothering me? And the older I get, the faster I move through that cycle. And frankly, the easier it gets, where it doesn't even feel this big thing anymore. Like, oh, after this conversation, and sometimes I'll write it down to clarify my thoughts, but I think that if anybody's listening and any of this is resonating and they know that perhaps they're a work environment where they have conflict and things they haven't said and they're feeling daunted by that, I want to say that's okay. That makes perfect sense. That's normal. It probably means you care about this person. And I promise this is a learnable skill. And on the other side of it is not only more professional performance, but a better life.
Yeah, I think deep appreciation for what you said a couple moments ago of, I love conflict and I want to have those conversations. Those two pieces are huge, right? Because we have people that love conflict or appreciate it. And I think you did a great job of qualifying why you like it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, that's great. Right. Well said.
We'll go into that in a moment. But when you say you appreciate conflict, there are certain people that love it just for the sake of conflict, right? Right. And we see this because social media is a mirror to the world. It allows people, and this will go into a later order theme of accountability. We've talked about this before. I think if everybody had to have a verified account, you'd see a lot less of chasing conflict for conflict's sake on social media, because you can tie it to somebody. Oh, hey, yeah, Rod, I know you live on 98th Avenue. I'm coming to talk to you. But when you say having that conversation, that's huge, because here's the cognitive dissonance that I see with a lot of leadership BS out there. And something that I learned about you that actually in just listening to you makes me feel closer to you is people will say they value time, right? Time's the non-renewable resource. Time this, time that, time that. Yet they're not willing to embrace conflict. And so my wife and I had this discussion at one point in time. We had gotten into an argument like married couples do. I don't know if anybody else is married, and maybe you don't. That's great. And she said, I just think you love conflict. And I said, here's the thing. I don't love conflict, but I appreciate conflict more than I do passive aggression. Because if somebody... Yes. If somebody is passive aggressive, that's rot. That's foundational rot, toxicity, waiting. It's the closest synonym is resentment and just blech. I go, if we have conflict, at least we can get it out. And it's that idea of, cross more wires to create more sparks. Now, I have an urgency for that because having nearly lost my life at a young age, time is at a premium. So I'm like you, Mark. I would rather get it out. Now, our audience is also going to be biased and appreciate you listening to that because this is what we do at our workshops, right? Like,
Sure.
and this is interesting too, because it's brought about conflict in how we describe these things, right? So we gave them the title Apprenticeship Communication Workshops. And then what we found early on is some of the conflict of people that were like, well, I don't know, they didn't know what communication meant. And I was like, oh, okay. So they had conflict of this idea of, well, are you just is this 16 hours of leadership cliches and whatever? And we're like, no, this is actually a chance where we're doing role playing to embrace and enhance and contextualize conflict through conversations and elevated constraints. And I'm speaking to the choir with the idea of role playing and improv and constraints. And so we love it when people say, well, this would never happen in real life. Nobody would be that indignant. Nobody would be that blank. And I go, you say that. Yeah. First of all, let's talk about how practice should be harder than the real thing, right? Like we want elevated constraints. And then what we find is there's this heightened, once there's conflict in these workshops, right? They get called to do improv or whatever. It's, but then afterwards, it's kind of like getting out of a cold tub. They feel a lot better. And it speaks to your point. Conflict, yes, can be harrowing and it can be messy and it can bring out the worst in us, but then it allows for reflection. It allows for efficiency. It allows for us getting to the core of what this thing is so that it doesn't rot and infest from the inside out. Does any of that make sense? And am I hearing you correctly and why you appreciate conflict?
Yes, 1,000,000%. And I'll add one more brief
Please.
lens on that I think is another interesting addition to this chat is there's something to be said for the ethics of being willing to have the direct conversation, right? Because I very much resonate with, I really struggle with people are passive aggressive. I emotionally understand different people have different things, right? And I totally get that. I am very lucky in that I married a woman who is actively aggressive when we have an issue, which I much prefer. The longer I've been doing this, like, listen, I want kindness and I want people to because I can be sensitive, I get that. Like, I'm not saying that I want my team to unload me all the time, but honestly, I'd rather them yell at me than have an issue that I don't know. Because number one, that might mean at the very least, I'm missing feedback about how I'm coming across to somebody because it's not my intention to make somebody upset, number one. And number two, sometimes they're factually incorrect. They are misanalyzing the data. They're looking at my behavior and they're making leaps that are inaccurate because they don't have the whole picture. They're missing a lot of the data, right? So there is a book, which I presume you may have ever heard of or read, Principles by Ray Dalio, who's a famous hedge fund investor. And they often refer to Bridgewater, his hedge fund, as a human behavior experiment because they take this so far where they actually record, I think this is true, they record every meeting that happens. And if your name is mentioned in that meeting, you will get a transcript of it. Because his belief is that it is unethical to not bring to somebody any issues you're having with them because you are being judge, jury, and executioner. You're not stress testing your beliefs. You're looking at a sliver of their data. You've made a decision, then you've written them off, and you're lacking the courage to share what your hypothesis is with this individual, where they either have the opportunity to grow or in some cases, correct you because you are wrong. You're actually just missing some of the data. Now, that is probably not to everyone's cup of tea. Like, that's a very extreme way of doing it.
Hard in a small business, right? Like,
yeah.
Somebody listening's got 4 people on their, like, how do they make that actionable, right?
Yeah. And they are obviously just like one of the most profitable companies in the history of the world. So they, their tech, I'm sure, is like over the top. And I'm perhaps remembering this like slightly wrong, but I think it is that. And that's one of their things in their culture. It's like, you're a weasel. If you get caught doing that, you're out, you're fired. If you talk about somebody behind their back when they're not in the room, which is like, wow. But I am frankly kind of inspired by it. It's maybe not everyone's cup of tea, but there's something about that level of honesty and rigor. Because also at the very least, you're now moving into, and apparently I'm going to quote every book I've ever read, you're now moving the 4 agreements, be impeccable with your word, right? If you're going to say it in a way that you would say it if they're there, instead of venting to one of your coworkers and creating some toxicity around an issue that you're probably missing some of the data on.
Yeah, well, and it brings a good point to this idea that it's not even that being good enough at communication is not the answer, because there's context and the fit between the two, right? Like attunement happens between how you communicate, how somebody else receives that and interprets that, and then the fit of the context, right? The setting, circumstances, and situation in which this thing occurs. And it was interesting because I had a conversation just the other day with somebody that, again, in a pretty conflict-oriented way, said, well, I think I'm good enough at communicating, right? Like I bartended for X amount of years. I did this. I led a company. I'm good enough at communicating. And there's a lot of things that are wrong with that statement. You and I know that. Right. But let's imagine it was true, right? Let's look at the adjacent possible and alternate reality. Let's say that him or you or I were whatever the definition was of a strong communicator. Well, that still doesn't matter if the other person who's receiving the message is not a strong communicator, right? That's theory of mind, right? You could be a strong communicator and think that you're getting something across clearly, and maybe you are, right? Maybe you're using you're framing things correctly, and you're using their language, and you're listening to them, and you're doing all the hallmarks of it. But we still can't control all of their personal experiences and perspective with the terms and words we're using. And so it's interesting, right? Because it becomes this thing that if we don't have the context and we don't have this idea of what are these person's drives, what's the environment in which we're having this discussion, what are their past experiences with it, much like a doctor wouldn't like, hey, here's some medication. By the way, I don't give a shit about what your medical history is.
Right.
And then somebody said, well, this stuff is messy. I don't get why I should have to think this much about it with communication. I'm like, then I don't know that you want to run a business. I certainly don't. Like, you have to take accountability over the context and the way that you communicate. Like, that's the gist of it, right?
It's the whole game. Yeah, it's the whole game.
You know, and when you think about, you mentioned power dynamics too. Here's something I was curious, because how many people are on your staff?
Oh, it's changed so dramatically over the past year, and we've been hiring so aggressively now. I think we're probably around 17-ish, 18-ish right now, I think.
Okay, great. And so within that, and then you have a business partner, Michael Keeler, right?
Correct.
Right. And a little plug for your guys' podcast, Business for Unicorns. Mm-hmm. So we look at that, and here's what I know. Here's what I want to know within the context of power dynamics. As a leader, or however you want to define yourself within the culture and nomenclature of your organization, there's this balance, right, where people need to hear you. They need to respect you, and mutual respect, of course. Just go with me. But sometimes you have to give away some of your power, because we want to empower others.
Sure.
And so we know we can't live in the Mad Men era where I'm Don Draper and I'm just ordering people to get me scotch or whatever I want.
Right.
But then it's tricky because, and this is my opinion, feel free to disagree, if we went full on like holacracy, right, those lines can get blurred because we're inherently hierarchical animals. How do you balance, and feel free to give one example, because I know we can't do one size fits all, but how do you balance, like, there's a time where you need to be Mark Fisher and somebody needs to hear something and they need to understand that it just needs to be done. And then also times where you're like, hey, you're in charge here, right? I'm going to take a backseat to this. Talk to me about some of the thought processes at the basic level that go through your head then when giving away your power.
Yeah, it's something I think a lot about, because it's something that I have learned about myself. I trend towards an unhelpful lean all the way towards a holacracy style approach, because I personally have such a rage for autonomy that my impulse, which is not actually, I don't think, helpful, is everybody should do whatever they want. We're all liberated. Just as, I trend a little bit too much to maybe taking over responsibility time. Well, I'm not a good enough leader. I didn't inspire them to set their alarm clock and they were late 5 days in a row. This is my fault. I need to get to be a better leader. And it took me a while, I think, to realize that I was overcorrecting. And here's a brief tangent for listeners. For anybody that reads a lot about the stuff, if you read a lot about communication, if you read a lot about business, yet again, our friend contacts can run us into issues, because what I've discovered is, because I was somebody that prized organizations that create people that are perfectly autonomous. We shouldn't even have titles. At the end of the year, everybody just tells me how much money they want, and that's what they get. I am very inspired by that. And I am so naturally wired that way that a lot of the books I read, there were so much about like free people from the villainy of the corporation. I think it was almost like, to use like a training metaphor, like it made me like too flexible. I was already too wired like that. So I've had to learn how to be, I don't want to say more of a hard ass because that's not the framing, but really be better at holding people accountable and really driving people to hit very specific objective performance metrics with very meaningful consequences if they don't do it over time, right?
Hey, quick break for a moment. Listen, if you have gotten any value whatsoever out of this episode or any previous episodes, do me a favor and consider becoming a patron of the show. You can do this by going to artofcoaching.com/patron. That's PATRON. And listen, we get it. 2020 was a really tough year for everybody. And many of you are likely rebuilding or building something new. Well, we're just like you. We are 100% family owned, and we want to bring you high quality episodes. We want to bring you great guests. We want to bring you an enjoyable listening experience. But frankly, we can't do these things without your support. So we know some of you aren't maybe able, because of the lockdowns, to get to some of our workshops, or maybe now is not the right time for you to get involved in one of our courses, but you can show your support in many other ways. And by donating whatever you feel is right or comfortable for you, just know that we're deeply appreciative. Never easy for us to ask for help, but we certainly appreciate it. Again, that's artofcoaching.com/patron. And please tell a friend about the show. All right, back to Mark Fisher.
I've had to learn how to be, I don't want to say more of a hard ass because that's not the framing, but really be better at holding people accountable and really driving people to hit very specific objective performance metrics with very meaningful consequences if they don't do it over time, right?
Yeah, and thanks for, oh, sorry, keep going.
Well, I was going to say, so to answer your question specific about how I think about balancing, on the one hand, you got to make the donuts. Here's how we make the donuts. This is the system. Versus, can we collaborate together? I'd like you to make the decision. At a place like MFF, for the most part, a lot of that decision is made by, I think, the context of what the decision is and what that person's role is. So at MFF, for instance, I have an amazing fitness director that I work with very collaboratively. And oftentimes, we will work collaboratively on things, and I will explicitly say when I would like her to make the final call on things. I'll be very candid about, here's what I think, here's what I think we should consider, here's maybe the way that I would do it if I were going to do it. But ultimately, for instance, we're about to hire 2 new trainers. This is your call. You should make this decision. I'd like to be part of that, but you get to make this call. These are the people you work with. So it's interesting now, and this is the other thing I'll say, I've maybe thrived more recently because most of the people that I work with are at the manager level where we can have a more collaborative partnershipy type of relationship. Whereas my fitness director, for instance, Wheels, again, by no means am I saying she's a hard ass. If anything, frankly, the team, I think, would tell you she's undoubtedly a better manager than I am, but she's the one that's really making people cook the pies in the same way and really enforcing the systems and the standards in a way that I don't think I ever got really, really great at, in part because I don't think it's so kind of outside of, I think, my natural tendencies, and because I think I would have gotten better over time if I needed the reps to it. But the way the organization has evolved over time, most of the people I work with in some more collaborative way. And what is awesome is I have people that are going to run the train tracks. And I, to be clear, it's not saying that I don't ever have to come in and provide accountability to the management team. But for the most part, a lot of the people that I work with also at this point in my career, pro tip, is just finding people that I don't have to hold accountable. I don't want to have a to-do list and have to follow up next week. Yes, I'm perfectly capable of doing that. And maybe if you have some unbelievable contribution where you're adding value in this very specific way and you're some sort of artsy person, I kind of do that. But it is generally my preference for people I work with very closely, for me not to also have to follow up for the things you said you were going to do. That's your job. You do the things you said you're going to do, because I promise you I'm going to do mine and they will be done.
Well, and thank you for such specific examples on that, because, and I'm going to ask you to excuse me for like rambling a little bit here, because there's some jump off points that I want to touch, and then I'll allow you to take it wherever you want. But this, in the spirit of mutual sharing, those kinds of power dynamics within an organization can be things I struggle with as well, right? Because I realized quickly, okay, I know how I can be perceived. I'm a bearded guy, a little bit bigger than average. I have a boxing background and a deep voice. If people are judging me superficially, I can come across as very aggressive. And if I'm honest, right, that's my archetypical way that I lean, is this kind of Wolverine, somebody that is a little bit irascible, right? There are experiences in my life that kind of made me realize, hey, you gotta look inward and trust yourself, because there's a lot of shady people out there and what have you. And, but then I have to pull the reins on that sometimes, because I have to make sure that nobody feels dominated or not valued or trampled on or what have, right? That idea of like a locomotive or a bulldozer. Right. But then on the other hand, there have been times where I pulled back too much. And then I had staff kind of saying, hey, we actually, and these weren't their words, this is meant to be a little bit humorous, tongue in cheek, where they wanted me to play daddy a little bit. They wanted me to kind of come in and not be heavy handed, but be very clear and very directed and say, hey, boom, 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 boom. And it's an interesting dichotomy as a speaker too, right? Because when you speak, and you speak all over the world when COVID's not happening, you want to come in, and it's this catch-22 where in some audiences you have to establish credibility and authority. Now, hopefully, just the way you present and provide value does that, right? You don't need to prove value, provide value. But there are certain instances, like we're doing a workshop this weekend, where there's going to be a lot of folks in an alternate kind of a field that maybe haven't followed my background, right? Sure. Or maybe and so you do have to kind of, again, lazy word choice, but just in the sense of cognitive ease, flex a little bit and say, hey, here's my background. Here's why I'm here. Here's why I'm here. And so this constant tug of, when do I elevate power, which is obviously a situational resource and it's a relational, and then when do I decrease it? And then, man, when I think I'm being fair to everybody, or when I think I'm being empowering to somebody, I'm actually not helpful. And we had a staff member, we have a great relationship, so they wouldn't mind us sharing this, even though they're not a part of the team anymore, that they were more like that. They wanted me to wake up every day and kind of say, hey, these are the core objectives. And no matter how much I laid this out within principles and a deck and, all these mediums of communication, they needed me to pop, 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 pop. And I just said, hey, it's not that kind of environment. One, even if it was a brick and mortar, it's definitely not that kind of environment, given that it's a remote situation now.
Right.
We're across time zones, and I don't hire smart people so I can constantly tell them what to do. I hire smart, adaptable people so that they can actually maybe even suggest or tell me what to do sometimes. Sure. Sure. And so that I wonder then, to build off of that, how you manage that accountability when you had to go remote. How do you manage it, especially with your mind working as quickly as it does, and knowing that there's not a great interactive tool? Yes, there's Miro, and yes, there's virtual, Zoom, and there's so many different ways, but I know your mind, and you have a million ideas spilling out. I have the same problem. How do you keep people informed at the pace in which your mind works, or even accountable when it's all remote?
Yeah. So we have, I think at MFF, one thing we have gotten very dialed in is what meeting pulses work for us. And I think a lot of it is, at least for me, both with our weekly leadership meeting and with my one-on-ones with each of the managers that report to me directly. The weekly meeting pulse, I think, is the heart of that, where every week we come in and we each are curating an issues list of things we need to discuss. And then each meeting ends with a list of to-do items that are going to be done by the next meeting. So again, the with my managers, the dynamic is a little bit different, though I can share that there have been some conversations and some moments where things weren't happening the way that I thought we had agreed to. And in those situations, what I have found to be useful over the years, and this took me a long time, I think, to understand this dynamic, is the importance of, again, as candid as I'm willing to be, one thing I've realized is accountability conversations need to be escalated. So I always talk about this when I'm teaching management stuff, is what you don't want to do is have accountability Groundhog's Day, where you have the same conversation over and over. Because not only is that frustrating for you, but sometimes the person you're working with, and this took me a while to understand, sometimes just doesn't get it. So another thing that's different, because people are very different, is some people I think are a little more sensitive to stuff, and you don't need to put a lot of spin on the ball because they're going to be so hard on themselves that there's a suggestion that you've displeased them as the leader. It makes a meaningful emotional hit, and they do not want to feel it again, and they are on it. Other people, and I'm speaking very generally, of course, but other people are a little bit more laid back. So like, oh yeah, I messed it up. Oh yeah, I'll get that next time. And then they do it again because it doesn't really register for them. And what I have come to understand is part of what is helpful for me with them is to really escalate that conversation. And of course, when you're doing it online is a little bit different, because in the real world, the paradigm that I used was related to the crucial conversations, follow-up, crucial accountability, where the first conversation is about the content, the second time it's about the pattern, and the last time it's about the relationship. And that, I think, is a good framework to understand they're actually different conversations. You don't keep talking about the late email response. The second time it's about the pattern that you've been having to talk about, it hasn't changed. And the next time it's about, this is the impact it's having on us. This is the cost on our relationship. Now, admittedly, this is harder to do in the virtual world, because in the in-person world, I would also add to each of those. The first one about the content is like kind of a no big deal. It's like, hey, I noticed this thing. I'm going to be crystal clear. I'm curious what was going on there. I thought this was going to happen. Okay, cool. Because oftentimes, and anybody listening to this that manages understands, if people mess up a thing here and there, that's normal. That's not a big deal. You address that, it's fine, you move on. If it happens a second time, now this has to be escalated, because not only you're talking about the pattern, but if we were to get hyper specific, now this isn't just a casual comment after the meeting. It's like, hey, Brian, will you come here with me for a minute? Can I talk to you? And you will actually look to ideally change the physical space. Maybe even go sit down there for a second. You want to land different, like your body language wants to be different. And then for the third one, now it's going to be like a formal meeting. Now it's going to be like, hey, Brian, I'd like to meet you at X time. We're going to have a conversation about this thing. Can you meet me next o'clock? Now you're in an office, the door is shut, you're both sitting down. And I think that nuance of escalating it, I'm not sure right now that I have as obvious of ones to do for a virtual life, because you lose some of that. But I think the thread that people can take if they do any managing is just understanding that you have to meaningfully escalate the conversation in every way, because for a lot of people, and it's not even they don't want to do a good job, it's just a certain type of person, it just doesn't register. And I struggled with that for a long time, because for me, it registers. I want to do a very good job. And, and I have people I've worked with that frankly, they're easy to manage. I think I'm easy to manage. I have to mention it once and I can tell it's so heavy for them that I don't have to mention that again. Whereas the individual, it maybe needs that extra delineation over time, might still be very effective and frankly have skill sets that I do not have, because maybe they don't trend to neurosis quite the same way. And they really benefit from that system. Having said that, the times I've had to do that in the virtual world, I feel like we have been successful with it. Admittedly, I lose those other tools of physicality, but I think a lot of that can still play. I think sort of making sure there's a follow-up email communication about it, making sure you're writing things down, and again, just being candid about where you're at within what it is that you're actually talking about, what kind of impact is going to happen on their future professional opportunities, what sort of impact it's having on you emotionally, which again, I'm a big believer of bringing emotion in the workplace. Like it's there, I'm going to feel it. Let's talk about that. That's part of the process. So those are some thoughts I have on that.
Yeah, I think, you mentioning, first of all, I'm glad you talked about how there has to be some escalation, right? Because we got into this period within management and leadership for a while where it was all this idealized, very influenced by Silicon Valley, right? Whereas now we're disrupting the disruptors and we don't have formal meetings. Bullshit. There's a time for a formal meeting, right? Like, and I love that that was your tier 3, right? This idea of like, there is a time where you just need to shut the door and get down to brass tacks and have an eye-to-eye conversation, right? And it can't be filled with disclaimers and all this. Of course, you need to use respectful language and what have you. But I think we're losing that. We're losing that we say we want to get into the messy realities of leadership and that we want things that are visceral and real, and we're tired of all the idealized crap, but people are still scared to do this. And I think if they looked at it in the frame, especially those that are strength coaches or trainers, you have progressions and regressions for your exercise, right? You have ascension models for business. You need to do this thing for your conversations. We do something similar. And if this helps you in any way, right? Not that there's going to be much I can tell you, where we had to have a conversation early when we went remote of creating kind of this pyramid of, hey, when we have certain conversations, what medium are we using? Right. Mm-hmm. Like, so we know that if there's customer service complaints or billing issues, E is for evidence. It's going to be on email, right? If there's something within the staff where maybe somebody misunderstood something or misinterpreted, or there's something more nuanced, that yes, we still want a record of that, but maybe we're going to use Marco Polo or Zoom or WhatsApp and what have you, because then that does bridge the gap a little bit, not of the proxemics, but the physicality of now you can see how I'm gesturing, right? You and I are talking over Zoom. The audience may not see that. They will if they go to our YouTube, but like there's physicality and there's emotive things happening here. And so, I'm just glad that you did mention that, because I do think that it's very easy, especially because the primary educational resource for many aspiring leaders is books. And you can start reading these books that eschew these formal meetings and try to give you, like, I think of it as shared workspaces, Mark, right? Like when we did that at a previous job, love the idea, love the concept. But for me, it was more of a distraction. I needed sometimes to get the hell, I'm very secluded. I do my best thinking when I am a little bit secluded after being around people. Mm-hmm. I do not want to go coach out on the floor or go speak at an event and then come back and be surrounded by people when I'm trying to synthesize what's going on. Right. How do you feel about those kinds of things?
Oh yeah, it's interesting. I personally, and this is a thing that in the odd chance somebody here is familiar with Mark Fisher Fitness and my personal brand, which is known for being a little bit out there and eccentric, and I am out there and eccentric, and I understand that. I think that's true, but I'm also very much an introvert. So it's been interesting for me because I, in a given day, discovered I like to have about 3 hours of meetings at most, which I know is some people, depending on your work situation, is maybe quite jealous, but like, I don't like to, I'll do 4. 4 is kind of my max. Anything more than that, I just can't get anything else done. And a lot of my job is project work. And a lot of my job is, particularly these days with so much change, is thinking, is literally just thinking about stuff and coming up with ideas and trying to solve issues. To your point about moving away from meetings altogether, yeah, I think it's not the best way to go. It's interesting. I heard a podcast recently that I thought was so interesting, was Cal Newport, who I'm sure is an author. I'm sure you're familiar with Brett, but for listeners, is I think a very smart guy. He's written a number of books, Deep Work, Digital Minimalism. And I guess his most recent book is essentially making the point that so much of this digital asynchronous communication is actually robbing people of their creativity and their peace of mind, because we're just getting binged and buzzed all the time. And it was potentially another example of overcorrection, because the point he made very much resonated with me for the reasons I've discussed earlier in this conversation, is that it was if people took Peter Drucker's, this famous management thinker, his admonition that we need to, again, free people from the business, let the workers be totally autonomous. So in theory, by giving people emails and phones and all these things, in theory, well, now we can do work whenever we want, right? This is amazing. We're free. Well, the problem is now we can do work whenever we want. And what's happened is, for many people, and this is something I talk a lot about my time management work, their work time bleeds in their non-work time. Their non-work time bleeds in their work time. So they're not kind of working kind of the same way. And as much as even at MFF, it's interesting, we also have been experimenting with like how little meetings we can get away with. But I don't think no meetings is the way to go. I think the pulse of the meeting, admittedly, is going to depend on the relationship, depend on what the project is. But I've even been thinking about recently, we might explore this at some point. This is fascinating to me because 2 years ago, I never would have considered this. Knowing, for instance, right now, our trainers like live their whole life on Marco Polo, which blessedly I'm not on because there's a lot on there. And I'm a little wondering if this is actually the best move. And this is the kind of conversation I'm having with my fitness director, because I'm wondering, and I'm wondering if you have perspective on this, if you use this with your team. My concern is I'm afraid they're going to feel burnt out because they're like always kind of working. And then it's also their great friends. So they're also being like, oh yeah, I noticed this thing with this ninja, we'll keep an eye out for it. Oh, by the way, everybody, hot tip, check out this new show on Netflix. So it seems to be working amazingly for them. So right now I'm letting wheels make that decision, but I am somebody that is very delineated about when I'm working and not working. So my phone is always on do not disturb. I joke, I call it the Sheena machine because my wife's name is Sheena. My phone is for the Sheena machine, right? And I'll do calls and things. It's not that I won't get text messages, but that constant buzzing, the constant buzzing and binging of tech, I don't think is probably great for people's ability to concentrate, number one. And number two, purely from an efficiency standpoint, just sometimes like faster to have conversations and have some form of standing meeting. Again, I'm not offering this prescriptive because I don't know your business, dear listener, but I don't think it's no meetings. That I feel strongly about.
Yeah. Do you, just to make sure I heard you correctly, do you want me to sound off on the Marco Polo thing first? Or
yeah, I'm curious to hear, your 2 cents on it, because again, I'm not in it. So, and for me, it's theoretical. Again, my fitness director I trust says, no, it's great. We love it. It's good for us.
Sure.
What do you think? Are my concerns warranted? Is that a potential issue?
Well, let me say this first. Okay. So my staff's not as big as yours. We've had to do some restructuring and we're building some new things as well. And so, but we did manage at one point in time, let's see, what was it? 3 full-time staff. And then when we looked at contractors, what have you, as many as 15 at any point in time, right? Spread throughout the US and also internationally, whether we are developing a course, what have you. Now, I'll talk to it as it is today, right? So we use Marco Polo mainly, and we have a specific art of coaching group. And I definitely agree with you that if there was no kind of principles binding it of saying, hey, like understand that this probably isn't the place for like casual, like check out this show.
Right.
So we typically say within, and again, we give them this visual of, where does this fit within our communication-based hierarchy or tool set? We know that this is for something that, because like you said, face-to-face communication is the most effective medium there is for picking up on all subtext and nuances of communication, right? So if something fairly complex needs to be discussed, that's why we like a Zoom, but Zoom, you have to be in your office and whatever. So let's say somebody is not in that situation, then we'll use Marco Polo. Now we also say, because you can write a note, we try to say, hey, no need to respond, within this time frame, or maybe this is urgent or what have you. But we just try to respect some of those boundaries. Now, what boundaries? I love that you said, hey, dear listener, I don't know your business, right? Yeah. Nothing we say is prescriptive, because right now we might as well be in the startup phase again, because my wife joined the company, our longtime executive assistant had another baby. She had to step away. So then my wife went from real estate and other things to learning what we do. Not the easiest, because we have live events, online courses. We do online communication training. We help somebody running for mayor with their political campaign. There's a lot of, sometimes we're getting things from out of the blue we've never dealt with before, right? And that's why systems don't always work, because we like roadmaps, right? A map. Right. If I want to get to Dubuque, Iowa, for whatever reason, and I don't like the road I'm on, I'm taking another road. And you have the legend that at least gives you the guiding principles. This system shit is overdone. I get that there's a place for it, but systems fail when apathy prevails. And you see that with airlines and all these other highly systematized things. When you bring in the human element and humans don't give a shit, then all that system falls to pieces. So we found benefit of it. We're not using it right now as much as we used to. We've never used Slack. We do use WhatsApp quite a bit, because WhatsApp allows for the voice messages that can be fast forwarded, rewound, and again, nuances. But yeah, I think that if people don't have these constraints of like, hey, here's this tool, be aware of how it should be used and when it should be used, it for sure, like anything, could get out of control. Did that answer your question enough, or can I get more content?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It sounds like you've just really thought through the frameworks for how you use it and how you don't use it. And again, this is an example, right? Me being like, you make the decision, fitness director, this doesn't make sense to me, but you're on the ground. You should be the one to make this call. If the trainers are liking it, go for it. I think I might bring back that little nugget and just offer one thing. Hey, what would you think about if we offer this framing? Maybe we get specific about only talk. And admittedly, I'll probably bring that term goes back. We're already doing that, Mark. But I think providing those guardrails around it, and really for any communication medium, but that makes perfect sense.
Email did that too, right? Email became really intrusive. And this is the trouble, and I respect the guy immensely, right? So this isn't, as you know, we can disagree with ideas and still appreciate the person, right? I think that it could even be problematic when we look at digital minimalism or things like Cal Newport talks about. In some situations, right? Let's say I say, hey, I value high context mediums of communicating. Well, in lieu of being able to be face-to-face or on video or what have you, voice or a phone call is up there, right? It's up there more than a text. We can agree, right? It's up there more than an email generally. And there's some people that don't need to use devices and things like that, but then they also have a publicist and they have a vehicle. Like I had somebody tell me the other day, well, this guy doesn't use social media. This guy doesn't. And I go, great. But that person's got a literary agent, a publicist, and a speaking agent. Right. And he's got people around the clock that do that. Whereas the average person trying to build a speaking career or what have you may need to leverage other mediums. And so I think that's tricky but for sure, any of these tools can get messy. I want to be mindful of your time, and I have a million other questions to ask you. So I have to prioritize here. So I'm going to go one that I know that you're especially passionate about. And if we touched on it, you can just say next. And then I'm going to ask you some kind of fire round questions. And don't worry, I'm not going to say what's your favorite, Mortal Kombat character or anything like that. when we talk about managing staff and we talk about metrics, you're obviously extremely adept at the human element. You're extremely likable, and whether you like hearing these things about you or not, you're very likable, you're very charismatic, you're charming, you're interested in the other person, you actually listen. I would imagine that by the end of this, what I'm saying, you could at least paraphrase 3 key points I've made because you actually care. Right now, given that, you still have to manage by some metrics. You still have to look at your staff and say, at the end of the day, what's critical here and what does the data show? Can you talk to us a little bit? And no amount is too basic, right? So there's a wide range of listeners, but what does that mean within your organization, managing by the metrics? What metrics even matter to you? And what tools are you using to do that?
Yeah. So at MFF, we track weekly metrics in a Google spreadsheet. It's very, very simple. We run a system called EOS, which is based on a famous book called Traction, which is yet another business book that is very good. And essentially what EOS is, which stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System, it is essentially a done-for-you commercial platform for your business that just makes sure you're doing all the things that any business needs to do. And there are a number of elements of the Traction system, a lot of which when we adopted, we discovered, oh, we're pretty good at this thing. We're pretty clear on the avatar, pretty clear on our marketing, we're pretty clear on our values. Where we needed a lot of help was starting to just do a better job of collecting data. So we have a top level scorecard of, I think it's about 11 or 12 numbers that correlate at a very high level with the health of the business. And that is a number of different things, everything from obvious things like number of active ninjas in our virtual home body workout to conversion percentages in our sales sessions to on a scale of 1 to 10, what was our average Ninja survey score from the previous week of sessions.
Sorry to interrupt, but just for the audience, Ninja, can you elaborate on that?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So at Mark Fisher Fitness, we call our clients ninjas. So it's for those of you who've never been to markfisherfitness.com, you may go. It is safe-ish for work, but I will warn you, will not be able to unsee what you see there. And very quickly, Mark Fisher Fitness is a gym for people that don't like gyms. I came from the Broadway community myself. So though we are, as you might be able to tell, nerds, and pride ourselves in being pretty serious about the fitness from not only a physiology, but a psychology standpoint, we really pride ourselves on making it very accessible to artists and other people that for whatever reason feel uncomfortable in a gym. So we call them ninjas, as we find that a bit more aspirational than clients.
Thank you.
Thank you. So those are the main top level scorecards. And we've been doing that for a few years, but it really wasn't until this past year, we really finally got rigorous about saying everybody on the team must have numbers, must have at least 1 to 3 numbers that track in a very direct way with their performance. Now, it took us a long time to do this because that's much easier to say than to do, because the challenge is not everything is easily measured. And a lot of things that really, really mattered can't be directly measured. So I would caution you, if you are to start doing this, if you're not doing this yet, you should. And my qualification is we also want to be mindful of the tyranny of the quantifiable. We want to be careful that we don't overweight the numbers, and we don't want to underweight more subjective elements, because the reality is there's always going to be a subjective element of assessing performance. I don't think that ever goes away. But if you're purely subjectively assessing things, now you have to manage and give raises and things based on stories. It opens you up, frankly, to bad actors potentially manipulating the system. Whereas when you create very clear data, very clear weekly metrics that you can track, not just to a department, but to an individual, that give you a sense of how they're performing in light of the particular ways they need to contribute to the organization's financial objectives and spiritual mission, because again, they both matter. You got to have both. You can't have one or the other. That makes, I think, the conversation a lot easier and a lot fairer in some ways, a lot more transparent. And again, as always, you want to be careful what it is you're asking for people to do, because incentives can be wildly dangerous, right? Like much of life is just about getting the incentives right. But I think it's been a real game changer for us as far as having clear sense also for the team and giving them games to win, so they know on a weekly basis how they're doing. And again, it's not the only thing, but it's a very important thing. And for us, it perhaps has been a theme of this conversation, I now see have, by dint of my personality style, probably overweighted the art I don't want to say like I overweighted humanity, because I don't think that's a thing, but perhaps I underrated the require for the rigors and the numbers and the system, which is not to say that I don't enjoy those things. Clearly I do, but it just took me a long time, I think, to really get to the place where they were balanced, because my natural tendencies veer me off a little bit. And maybe I'll give this as a final parting thought. Part of why I think self-awareness is so key for humans and for leaders are, over time, if you listen to the feedback around you, you will begin to understand the places where you are slightly askew one way or the other, and you can start to overcorrect. So you might discover you're overly permissive with your management broadly. And while that might work with some people, a certain type of individual, you might flourish if you're managing them. That might mean generally you need to become a little bit more prescriptive, perhaps a little bit more of a taskmaster. Conversely, if you know you trend naturally towards wanting to just squeeze the life out of people and just demand them to comply with what you're demanding them to do, you might benefit from correcting the other way a little bit and learning to be a little bit more human.
Well said. And I appreciate the term self-awareness as well. So we'll make this quick for you, and then we're going to go into everywhere people can support you, find you. You already mentioned it with the website, but we'll talk about it 12 more times because we want people to support. Given this, what is your biggest communication barrier or weakness right now, right? You're obviously very self-aware. You take self-education very seriously. You've been in a wide range of dense and diverse learning experiences. You have strong theory of mind, but inevitably none of us are as good as we think we are, right? This is the core of my doctorate, and our business is communication. Yeah. And I'm very aware of where I'm a poor communicator. Where's your biggest gap right now?
I'm sure I have knowledge gaps that I'm not aware of. I still know, and I don't know how much of this is just perfectionism is not realistic. I still know that I have the ability to rub certain types of people the wrong way. And I haven't, if I knew exactly what it was that was doing that, maybe one day, Brett, I can hire you, can help me figure this out. Because, and again, this is related, I think, to another challenge I have, which is related, which is I struggle a lot of times with perfectionism in my relationships in the way I do not with my work. With my work, I will write a piece of crap and I don't care. And it's shitty and it's dumb. And tomorrow I'll make it better. I don't care. So with my work, I'm pretty good at ready, fire, aim. I can get overly sensitive about desire to be liked, which I know, of course, creates the very circumstances I don't want, right? And so I'm not sure that I'll ever be 100% perfect, never rubbing people the wrong way. But particularly when I'm talking with the team in group settings, I don't always accurately understand the way I'm coming across to every individual. And like I said, I'm having a real conversation with myself. How much of that is, well, them's the ropes. If you're talking to 20 very different people at a time, some people are going to take different things. But it's something I would like to get better at. Something I haven't solved yet. So that's one.
Yeah, it's a good answer. I mean, I think to just offer any solace, if it is peace of mind, right? I think that it's important to state too, and we talk about this at our workshops, which you're coming to at some point. I'm forcing you. And
I'd love that. That would be a real treat for me.
It's on the house and we do them all over. But anyway, it's tricky, right? This is what we learn about communication is there's no one perfect style, of course. At our workshop, we certainly don't try to teach people to speak just one way. That would be maladaptive, especially cross-culturally. And it's interesting enough in that you could see two academics speaking about it, and you could see two people in Southie in Boston speaking with wild tonality and slang and what have you. And you can't really say one's inherently just across the board a poor communicator because of word choice, rate of speech, or what have you, because it depends who they're talking to in the shared code of meaning between them. Right. And so like to your point, when you're speaking to 20 people and them's the ropes, inherently, there's not going to be one way for you to elocute perfectly to them all. But it's just about an awareness. So that's a good answer on your part. Now, here's an interesting one, right? It gets into behavior change and perception. How? Because inevitably, many people think they're better at communication than they are, right? And it's many subpoints. That said, right, people don't have any trouble gravitating to technical, tactical things. They'll spend thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands getting better on all that. It's the established norm. How would you, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, so just have fun with it, be loose. How would you sell somebody on the importance of communication? How would you say, hey, this is something that you, not sell them logically, right? I just mean like, let's say they have to go to our workshop or what have you. What are you doing to get their attention and draw their attention to something they think they're already good enough at and don't need help with?
Oh gosh, I probably struggle with this because to me, it seems so obvious. Right. I think the case that I would make is there's the only way you are able to impact the world beyond the constraints and the finite resources you have as an individual human, if you want to impact other people in any meaningful way, that only happens through communication. It's literally the only other way we can have any impact, any influence, any ability to leverage change outside of ourselves. That only happens through communication. So if we look at this to the inversion, if you're not able to effectively communicate with other people, then your only point of change in the world is yourself. And listen, that can be valuable. There's, I think, a lot to be said for learning how to affect change in yourself. But I think the reality is virtually anybody that has a mission of any kind, definitionally, it's not just about you. Like whatever it is you want to do in the world, even if you just want to make money, that's always going to happen through other people, right? None of us are an island. So to that end, there's nothing more valuable than learning how to be adept at really communicating to other people in a way that allows you to be understood. And of course, the twin of that is allowing the other to truly learn to understand other people so that you really both know where they're coming from, and importantly, they feel understood and you connect in a meaningful way. So yeah, that's my go at pitching it. Yes. Why would you not do it, people? Listeners, though I imagine if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't have to be sold too hard.
Yeah, no, it's just it's interesting to get people's perspectives on those things, right? And so I appreciate you riffing on it. Final one, what would make you, right, feel most supported right now? Obviously, we're going to direct people to markfisherfitness.com, 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 all these things. But just in any level, if somebody meets you on the street someday and COVID's done and they can shake your hand or whatever, they can buy you lunch. What is something that when somebody just does it and they do it intuitively, you think that was really nice? I really appreciated that.
Yeah, well, listen, I certainly don't mind words of affirmation. I think specific positive feedback, and specifically when I think, like anybody that teaches professionally, when I hear specific examples of something I maybe shared or something that I attempted to teach that in some way either eased their own suffering or unlocked power within them or allowed them to be more effective at whatever their missions are. When they pass that on and I get to hear about that impact, that I've hopefully made a positive impact on this person, that is always like the greatest gift I can get from people.
Yeah, well, you definitely did that for me with a specific example of when I really went out on my own. I was still having trouble discerning what some of my time was worth and correct pricing for some of the increased consulting that I had been doing. And you took a moment and you got on the phone with me, and I was living in LA at the time, about to drive cross country to Atlanta. And, you gave me an idea, and you could have been protective of your rates. You could have been very context poor, but you didn't really know me from Adam other than a third-party introduction. And you took the time to do that. And I look at having a 15-month-old right now, somebody that I'm going to have to contribute to their college fund. I have a wife and a small business to support during a turbulent time. And had I not got that advice for you, that might have put me in a different place, right? I'm sure I would have figured it out at some point, but you expedited it. So if I can offer anything, that's genuine appreciation for you helping me figure out what my time was worth.
Oh man, well, I think the world of you, and I have such respect for you, and that means so much to hear. And I'm so glad we're able to connect on this. And yeah, I truly think the world of you, and I'm so impressed and appreciative of the work you're doing and the way you're doing it. So thank you so much for sharing with me. That means a lot coming from you.
Yeah, no problem. Anything else you want to leave people with, anywhere where they can follow you, anything else other than markfisherfitness.com? What else? Yeah,
you can come check out markfisherfitness.com. And Michael and I do business consulting, as Brett had mentioned. We mostly focus these days on training gym and micro gyms. So anybody who's a fitness industry professional, I know a lot of you listen. If you check us out at businessunicorns.com, we've recently started working with a dear friend, Pete Dupuis, who some of you might know, who also works with Eric Cressy, Cressy Sports Performance. So we've got kind of a growing bangerang team over there. So anybody looking for help with the business of brick and mortar fitness, come find me. We have stories and lessons to share.
Perfect. Well, we'll make sure those are all in the show notes, as they always are. Guys, thank you for spending some time with me and Mark. Please make sure to tell a friend, leave a review, spread the word, and support our guests. Until next time, this is the Art of Coaching Podcast, signing off.